I don't think they can hear me.
I don't understand. Your microphone is Sarah, I'm online.
Hi, everyone. We're going to start in the next few minutes, just waiting for a few more people to log in. Thank you.
Sarah, how's my audio?
I hear you. Sound good.
All right, so I don't need a headset or anything, right? And you've got a screen. You can see everything there.
Yep. All good.
Right. Let me just put a note on my door that I have a webinar in progress. So. All right. And I'm back.
It looks like people are still logging in, so let's start in about 2 minutes.
Sounds great. And we're going to run until about 3 o'clock, right?
Yep.
We have is there an option to be able to have people throw comments up in one part, whether through chat or like sort of a whiteboard? I know there's a couple of cool features that you have on this.
We have the chat capabilities.
Okay, so we could have people when I need. Okay, good. We can do chat at some point if we need to.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and it looks like on here you can optimize for full screen video clip. Do you know if that allows audio?
Yeah, it does.
Oh, okay. Does it generally work if we do a full screen video clip?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. I thought that Zoom wasn't great with video.
It really depends on your connection.
Okay. Well, if we have time at the end, I have one video that may be worth watching.
Oh, great. Okay, so let me start now.
Sure, you've got 70 on, so it's up to you when you want to. It's up to you.
Yeah, let's go ahead and start. So hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Sarah Hecht. I'm from JCC Association. Thank you so much for joining us today for this very important webinar. We'll run about 50 minutes and we'll leave time at the end for questions. So please refrain and enter all of your questions at the end in the chat box. I'll hopefully get to all of them. We'll also be recording this webinar and posting it on jcca.me within the next few days. So now let me introduce Adam Rosenberg, who will be presenting the rest of the time. Adam Rosenberg, Esquire, is the Executive Director of the Baltimore Child Abuse Center. As head of Baltimore Child Abuse Center, Adam Rosenberg brings together his passion for community development and his background in non-for-profit management and law to help institutions protect children from abuse and trauma. He has become one of this nation's authorities on mandatory reporting laws and original practices for children's advocacy centers. A graduate of Cornell University and the Benjamin Cardozo School of Law, Mr. Rosenberg prosecuted hundreds of domestic abusers, sex offenders, and child predators for the Baltimore City State Attorney's Office. In 2008, Mr. Rosenberg became the Baltimore Child Abuse Center's executive director, reinvigorating the nationally accredited center with renewed mission and purpose, and since has increased program offerings and revenues by 330%. Mr. Rosenberg frequently testifies before elected officials, lectures at universities, and provides comments to media. With their innovative blueprint for child protection, the Baltimore Child Abuse Center and Mr. Rosenberg have reshaped how youth serving institutions recognize and respond to abuse and trauma. Mr. Rosenberg consults nationally with organizations and advocacy groups on issues of child protection, board development, and social networking. So thank you for being with us today.
Thanks, my pleasure. Yeah, certainly thank you for that wordy introduction that I provided, I guess. And thank you everybody who's spending time on this gorgeous day if you're in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic, and let's see if we can get this done so you can get outside and maybe get some fresh air. If you have not used Zoom chat before, the Zoom function before, there is a chat function on this. Typically the controls are at the top of your screen, and so if you have a question throughout the presentation, or if there's a problem with audio, with video, if you have an issue, by all means, throw it into the chat and we'll be able to address it. I will not answer questions as they come up, but I'll find time at the right time in a presentation to answer questions or clarify there, and we'll have time at the end for some questions and answers. And with that said, let's get started. So today's topic is MeToo and the JCC. How to support and grow a safe institutional culture. And it's obviously a very timely topic, as this, you can't seem to go anywhere without being able to talk about some of these issues today. And in a large, vibrant community organization such as the JCC, there are risks and opportunities all around to be able to deal with this issue there. To further the conversation and to be able to protect your staff, as well as, most importantly, the constituents, the children, the adults, the participants, the members of the JCC. Over the next, let's see if we can, all right, we've advanced slides. Everyone's got the next slide. You're good there, Sarah? All right. So over the next 50 minutes or so, I want to be able to help you, I'm going to define and help you understand three big concepts. One is what abuse is, child abuse, what assault is in terms of sexual assault, and what sexual harassment is. And I think MeToo in many ways encompasses all three. I think it's important as an organization that we explore ways to intervene and hold staff accountable. How do we prevent the escalation of sexually inappropriate behavior that can lead to any one of these three adverse outcomes there? And perhaps most importantly, how do we empower each and every one of you, people who are members of your centers in your community, so they can recognize behavior when they see it, acknowledge that it's actually going on, and report it, which ultimately ends up stopping it from going forward. I think a lot of this starts with this image here, what Time Magazine termed as the silence breakers. These are women, and almost this whole movement is predominantly about women who have come forward and have expressed that they've been wronged in some way, that someone has broken a law, has violated their trust, has violated their safety, their space, whether when they were a child or when they were an adult. And it's taken this momentum to be able to come forward and begin to make a difference here, and to be able to do this as a dialogue. And certainly in my conversations with the JCC over the last several years around topics of preventing child abuse and responding to abuse, the issue of how do we respond in this Me Too moment was very quick to come up. And we saw the need to be able to provide you with tools as to how to respond to this there. Ultimately, it comes down to, I think, really two groups of people to be able to perpetuate this. One are essentially the enablers, the people who stay silent and allow abuse and harassment to happen. and two, obviously, the people who commit these abuses themselves. And in many cases, I think what we found is that there were many good people who sat on the side and felt paralyzed and didn't know what to do, and ultimately came forward to many strong, powerful, brave women who came forward to share their story. All of which falls under this Me Too moment, some of which was sexual harassment and some of which is sexual abuse. What is each of these? I think there's three pillars in the conversation right now, and certainly, I'm entitled to stand on our soapbox as a children's advocacy center. What we do is we respond to well over 1,000 allegations of sexual abuse, sexual assault, and human trafficking each year, helping children and our partners in law enforcement and social services navigate their way through it so that we can get answers to what had happened for children or for professionals there. And that a lot of Me Too has encompassed the sexual abuse of children and isn't necessarily recognized as the separate and distinct crime and act that it is. And so what you have before you here, I think, on your screen are really three pillars of this moment. One is the concept of sexual abuse of children, really embodied by the atrocities that Larry Nassar committed upon USA Gymnastics, and I think what we're beginning to see in today's news, USA Swimming as well. That there have been recorded hundreds of incidents of sexual abuse of minors, children, that were allowed to go on because people didn't report, or when it was reported, it was generally ignored. Following abuse is sexual assault, and I think that it's interesting that the Harvey Weinstein Hollywood scandals and allegations really centered around a lot of Harvey Weinstein and stars in Hollywood there. And while there are definitely recorded numerous instances of sexual harassment, there's also recorded and documented sexual assault that was alleged in these cases, that Weinstein not only made people feel uncomfortable and did things that led to a harassing environment, but did things that were overtly sexual assaultive in nature. Sexual assault can occur to an adult or a child. And I think that I'm holding up the separate pillar of sexual assault here, in that it is separate from sexual abuse, in that it impacts adults, women predominantly, and has different laws and requirements for organizations like the JCC to be able to respond to it. And then the last side of it is Matt Lauer and sexual harassment. And sexual harassment being probably the biggest, widest, and in some ways the least understood, but certainly the most talked about aspect of the Me Too moment, of just the institutional poor treatment of, again, predominantly women or gender-based harassment there. And the allegations that Lauer was alleged against Lauer, I don't believe, and I certainly could be wrong, but I don't believe were ever alleged to have been sexually assaultive in nature, but were rose to a level of harassment, of making colleagues and coworkers and people who reported to Lauer certainly put them in a position where it created a hostile work environment there. Three different people, three different strains of this Me Too moment, related in a lot of ways, and we'll explore how they intersect and how they differ. Child sexual abuse, there's many different definitions state to state. It's certainly defined on a state-by-state basis. But I think a good definition to be able to go upon for you to understand is that child sexual abuse is any interaction between a child and an adult, or even an older child, so that we can certainly have children, family members, children who are CITs, counselors in training at our JCC camps who are supervising other kids, older kids in classes of preschools, but people who are in positions of authority, care and custody, caretakers, who do an adverse interaction there. So between a child and an adult, and that child's used for sexual stimulation of a perpetrator or even an observer. Sexual abuse does not require physical contact. We've had numerous instances of employees at youth organizations, even regrettably JCC organizations, where photographs were taken, visual depictions were done, people were watched, and that was done for the sexual stimulation of the perpetrator, and that led to sexual child abuse. It's child pornography, it's child trafficking. It's also consent is not an issue. so that these children do not have the legal authority to be able to consent to a sexual relationship with an adult. And again, those laws vary from state to state. Your windows could be 13 years old and 18 years old. They could be 16 years old and 21 years old. But that there are people who are put into positions of authority, people who watch kids. And the general rule of thumb that I've certainly shared with people who we work with is that any staff member may not have any sexual interaction whatsoever with any child who is a member or program attendee of the JCC, and that even if the law in your state may create exceptions for that, I think by position of authority that these people have, and seen by children to exert authority over other staff, over other children, creates that environment of child sexual abuse there. And so under no circumstances may there be any sexual contact between staff, volunteers, adults, people of authority at the JCC, and children who are there. It seems patently absurd to have to actually say that in today's day and age, but I think that when you're coming up and making these clear-cut lines, this is one of the things that needs to be said. For the most part, in every state, children are generally perceived as people under the age of 18. So again, you need to look into what your state's rules are there, that sex is allowed between, say, 16 years old, 15 years old, consensual sex, but if the person's in a position of authority, they're still considered a child up until the age of 18. And so a good rule of thumb is under the age of 18 and a program participant, a sexual act would be considered child sexual abuse. Sexual assault, on the other hand, is sexual contact or behavior that occurs without the consent of the victim. And this is generally adults, although there can certainly be sexual assaults on children if the person perpetuating the assault is not in a position of authority or power. It includes many, many things to be sexual assault. Penetration of the victim's genitals, which actually is known as rape now by the Uniform Crime Reporting standards that the FBI puts out. So there really isn't a definition, a distinction between sodomy and oral sex and vaginal rape. But any penetration of a victim's body is known as rape throughout the nation there. Forcing a victim to do that, unconsented to penetrations there, somewhat state by state, but again, that's what sexual assault is. Attempts on that can be sexual assault, unwanted sexual touching, engaging in sex trafficking. All those are sexual assault activities there. Young people have the highest risk for sexual violence, by the way. So that the younger somebody is, the greater the likelihood is that they may be a victim of sexual violence. And so it's just interesting to note as you look at these different bands there, and these are people who are whether 18 to 34 and 12 to 17. Those are large chunks of people who were victimized, and so it's important that I think as we look at our younger population, those are the ones that are most vulnerable. Sexual harassment, which I think is the tipping point of this conversation, is something a little bit broader and less defined state by state. Sexual harassment is the unwelcome sexual or gender-based conduct. So it may not necessarily be conduct that is relating to an act of sex or sexual conversation, but can also be around gender, typically directed towards women. That creates a hostile work environment, one that makes it difficult for someone to work in, or a quid pro quo environment. Lawyers like us love this kind of Latin jargon, right? I'm a former prosecutor, I'm still a lawyer. But quid pro quo means that it's an environment that wants an exchange for something else. So being able to exist in this environment means you have to play along with these sexual or gender-based comments and things there. And an employee finds that undesirable or offensive. It includes a lot of different things. It certainly includes sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, sexual and physical and verbal harassment of a sexual nature. And that's a wide swath of things there that it can be, of different comments, different actions, certainly the way people feel like they've been handled or treated there. It's about unwelcome conduct, right? And unwelcome conduct is when the employee did not solicit or incite the behavior or found it offensive. And so what we have actually seen in courts is that there has been a finding over time that if an employee solicited the behavior, then they're complicit in it there or incited it. But employees who did not solicit that behavior or incite it, that when these actions have been cast upon them, they can find it certainly greatly offensive there. That is very different than invited conduct, invited but welcome, uninvited but welcome. So that certainly, this is not putting a prohibition on workplace relationships or workplace romance. That I think but it certainly makes it complicated in this day and age there. And it is also different than offensive conduct but tolerated. And typically the standard that courts have used is the reasonable person standard there. And so that if a reasonable person would find the conduct offensive, then it's worth noting that it probably is offensive. So even if some people would tolerate it, other people don't tolerate it there. But it is unwelcome conduct that when it's been conduct that's occurred and people find it offensive in nature there. Sexual harassment is not about your boss being a jerk. And it's generally called, so that your boss, just because he's being a jerk, doesn't mean he's breaking the law and doesn't mean there's some level of workplace discrimination. That you are not entitled to a trouble-free workplace. So you can certainly have a boss, a coworker, an environment that is a difficult, troubling, frustrating place to work. And that actually may include some level of sexual flirtation or innuendo. In and of itself does not constitute a hostile workplace. And I am not giving the green light to be able to then go forth and proliferate an environment where there is flirtation and vulgar language. But when that behavior occurs regarding a protected class, that is when it begins to become harassment. And there are several protected classes that the courts have found, which create harassment there. And obviously we're focusing on sexual today, but just it's important to note for the record that, those jerk boss behavior attitudes can't be solely directed towards one of these protected classes: race, gender, national origin, color, religion, pregnancy, disability, or age. And so the employer, the workplace, coworkers, they can't create that environment that ties specifically back to those protected classes. So that behavior and activity can't be so solely focused on where it's an uninviting environment for just women or just pregnant women or just people of a certain color or of a gender. So it's an important distinction. And I hope that it's not necessarily lost on you that bad behavior to a woman in and of itself does not equal sexual harassment, but bad behavior as a result of that gender, making it difficult to continue to work in that environment, begins to open up the possibility of a hostile work environment, which can lead to a successful sexual harassment charge. With me so far? All right, good. So, look, how are these acts different? As I've said, there's sexual abuse and sexual assault and sexual harassment. And so, there are three different but related parts here. Sexual abuse, again, refers to children. It is an act perpetuated by a caregiver, sometimes a family. These are people who a child depends on, people who you and I trust are going to watch our children and take care of them. And so when a adverse sex act or even a physical act occurs upon that child, it becomes sexual abuse. Sexual assault, on the other hand, is something that can be perpetuated by a stranger, someone who the victim knows. So certainly it could be someone they're dating, someone who's in a non-custodial role, an acquaintance, and it's going to involve Non-consensual sex acts. That is a typo. Sexual assault involves non-consensual sex acts. Let's be very clear about that. Yeah, let's fix that right now, especially if we're recording the webinar, right? Involves sorry about that, everybody. Non-consensual sex acts. That's embarrassing. Okay, so we're back here. Involves non-consensual sex acts. Adult, child, doesn't make a difference there. Sexual harassment, on the other hand, is something that's perpetuated in a workplace. So there is no charge of sexual harassment among non-work people, right? People on the same sports team, neighbors, PTA members, people who belong to a club. Sexual harassment is a work-based situation there. Sexual harassment claims that are sexual harassment activity that is not in a workplace is just offensive. And certainly, if it relates to anything that involves an unconsented to touching, then it could become sexual assault. But it has to be in a workplace. And it's typically created by a supervisor, but also can be done by a coworker that creates a hostile work environment. The first two acts are criminal acts. And there's also civil liability. So there are laws in every state, criminal laws in every state, that prohibit sexual abuse and prohibit sexual assault. There's also civil liability that could incur as a result of this, so that a lawsuit can be filed against an institution for permitting this to happen if sexual assault or abuse occurred by a staff member, if sexual assault or abuse had occurred on their watch and they didn't do anything about it there. Sexual harassment, on the other hand, there's not a criminal prohibition against sexual harassment in states. There are federal prohibitions to it in terms of what we've said is a workplace laws. There's EEOC complaints that can exist, and there's civil liability that can attach as a result of sexual harassment in the workplace. Someone posed a question, can a member create a hostile work environment for a staff person? Yes, a member of a member of the JCC is not a staff person. I think that's a very interesting question. If a member of the JCC who is not a staff person can create a hostile work environment. I think it depends who that member is and what the organization does in response to it. And so if the member is a board member, right, and the board member has authority, fiduciary, the ability to influence the hiring and firing and promotion of staff, then yes, I think a board member could contribute to a hostile work environment there. And a board member who's creating an unwanted sexual harassment situation can make the organization liable. It's a terrific question. I think similarly, if there is a member or members who are doing things, saying things that make staff feel uncomfortable, and the organization itself fails to respond to stop that behavior, then the organization can be found to be complicit in that behavior, and that they're allowing this sexually charged environment to continue. And so a member can create a hostile work environment for a staff person, depending on how the organization responds and depending on who the member is. Hope that answers your question. It's a great question that I had never even thought of before this. I'm going to actually write that down for future use. That's a great question. Sorry, great idea. Okay, moving on. These acts are related, and I think, as we found in MeToo, that quite often it was all referred to the same thing. Again, sexual abuse, the blue circle, under 18, care and custody matters. Sexual assault, there's no consent involved. Sexual harassment, also no consent, but it's more of an unwelcome environment there. Creates a hostile environment, or this quid pro quo act. Someone else just posted, how does gender, it's hard not to answer the question when they come up there. Gender discrimination plays into hostile work. I think gender discrimination in some ways is if the behavior and activity comes about as a result of that person's gender. And so, you know, I guess the pregnant employee, I think, provides a great example, right? That if the pregnant employee is being vilified for the fact that, you know, that they're taking extra sick days, that they're calling in sick, that they're not able to respond and provide and do their work like everybody else does, then you know, that becomes gender-based, because, you know, it's obviously something directed towards women, also directed towards pregnant people. I think that if only women are subjected to boorish bad behavior, right? That they're held to a different standard. That men aren't necessarily, you know, yelled at or isolated or embarrassed or shamed in the workplace. Not from a sexual, you know, notation standpoint, but that an employer treats all women poorly. Well, then I think we've got gender discrimination there, as it leads to a hostile work environment. That all men are treated well and all women are treated poorly, or some women treated poorly. That creates that hostile work environment as well. How are these things related? Look, at that intersection is a violation of criminal law. So that you know, that they're related. That there's a violation of criminal law between, you know, if it's under 18 and it's a sexual assault. There, those are both those sort of acts. The intersection between sexual assault and sexual harassment really comes around to unwelcome contact, right? That someone contact or conduct, that someone's doing something to you know, to generally a woman that is unwelcome, and if it is you know, violates criminal laws, penetration, touching, etc., it can be sexual assault. If it's unwelcome contact or conduct that is offensive, then it's sexual harassment. And then it intersects those two if it involves children. I don't generally believe that children can be sexually harassed unless they're working at the workplace there, in which we've created a sexual harassment scenario, that if there are children who have inappropriate comments directed towards them in a workplace. But I think that also can begin to turn into sexual abuse. And again, it depends on the workplace environment. That if it's, you know, a child working at the Gap, you know, a 17-year-old, a 15-year-old working at the Gap, and her boss is making offensive comments or, you know, sexually explicit comments to that child, it's probably not sexual abuse, because the boss at the Gap isn't providing that kind of supervision there. That would be sexual harassment. But if those comments are coming up from a camp counselor, from a teacher, from a program supervisor, it could be abusive there. Generally, Lauren, sexual abuse would not apply to adults over 18 with special needs. That would be more of an adult protective services, of vulnerable adult abuse. That would be there. So it's a good question. At the intersection of all of this is just an abuse of power and authority. And I think that is the heart of MeToo. That MeToo is not who touched who where, and you know, what was the criminal law that was violated, but at the very center of it is that abuse of power and authority, and that all of these acts, abuse, assault, harassment, is about the exploitation of power, is about someone who is you know, has the ability to exert power and authority over somebody else, and uses it to target, manipulate their victim there, to be able to control how the workplace runs, their ability to see what happens, you know, obviously regarding a child, or women, you know, in the world there. And so how do we begin to understand the exploitation of power and begin to dispel it? I think these are two great quotes that we learned when we began to dissect and break apart the Jerry Sandusky case, the Penn State sexual assault violations. And I think that, frankly, many of the same things were said during the victim impact statements in the Larry Nassar case, and in most cases that we learned. Both were victims in the Sandusky case who testified in their impact statements, and they said the following. And the upper one is, who's going to believe you? He's an important guy. And so it really becomes very difficult, I think, for employees to be able to come forward and say that something had happened to them. We've made this really a very difficult environment for people to come forward. We as a society create these standards that don't exist anyplace else. There is, and I will send to Sarah some amusing video links. I didn't realize we could, that video would be successful on this platform. But there's some great, videos that, kind of cheekily explore the different setups that we have had here with sexual harassment and sexual abuse. If someone reports a robbery, we don't grill the victim in the same way. We don't ask what they were wearing and, did they contribute to it there? Did they really want it? But we do that to our abuse and assault victims there. And certainly when it comes to people who are important, there's this notion that the important people would never do that. And so it's a he said, she said situation often. The latter one, I think, is so emblematic of children, but really of anybody who's experienced these cases of abuse, harassment, or assault, in that there's just multiple, emotions that are going through anybody there. That this witness testifies how they were freaked by it. There's fear that they'd never see their family again. There's remorse with apology. There's love. There's fear. There's shame. There's embarrassment. There's all these things going on that make it really complicated for any victim to process it, because generally the people who are doing this are the people who you've grown to trust and care for and like. And it's that violation of that trust that we talked about in the prior slide that makes this even more complicated and allows these abusers to get away with it. Common accusations, and I think these commonly occur across the spectrum here. So the victim's behavior and clothing, right? That these are things that we're constantly seeing, that their clothing and their behavior contributed to or showed their consent. That victims didn't fight back, that they didn't act like a victim, right? I mean, does anyone know what a victim's supposed to look like? They remained friendly, they remained employed there. They didn't come forward right away. It's important to realize that, when people say those things and they come forward with that, or we ask those questions like, why didn't so-and-so do something? That's common. And I think that's one of those things that we need to recognize, that those are common denominators among people who are accusing others of abuse and assault. Is that it's that flipping of the script. In another situation that I'm consulting on with an organization, that we're finding that the people who have raised the allegations of harassment or assault over the years are generally referred to as either one of two things. They're either crazy, or they're emotional, right? Or they're cold. And that we don't do that to men, and we don't do that in any other sort of work scenario situation, that we immediately characterize the person who's raised these allegations as crazy and emotional or cold. And that's really unfortunate that we quickly discount that there. And I think that those are terms that are regrettably often termed towards women in the workplace. And women victims there. And I think that we need to be able to not use those as determining factors if something happened or didn't happen there. And because someone is termed as emotional or cold doesn't diminish the value of their claim, whether it's a harassment, abuse, or assault. So I think half the reason you're here, and we're about halfway through, how do we create change? What do we need to be able to do to go forward to be able to break this cycle? One of the things that's important to do is be able to understand this continuum that exists in sexual violence, which the same principles apply to sexual harassment as well. And I really give a lot of credit to my staff for putting this section, these slides together there, about helping the viewer understand the sexual violence continuum. Those kind of accusations that we saw on the previous slide there about, their clothing, they didn't fight back, they're not acting like a victim, that contributes to the foundation of sexual violence. That there's this whole, immediately you can categorize these people who don't look like victims and didn't act with it, that we think they should act there. And that there tends to be, a continuum of sexually inappropriate behavior. By understanding the sexual violence continuum, it helps an organization begin to understand its own cultural norms and how it responds when crises comes up there. And there really are two parts of the sexual violence continuum: recognition of it and the frequency of it. So let's break them down piece by piece. Recognition is the first element there. It refers to how likely someone is to acknowledge a behavior to be sexually inappropriate. mean, how quickly are we going to be able to say, you know what, that's sexually inappropriate behavior? Physical sexual abuse would be on the high recognition behavior side of things. You know, one can assume that, you know, if we learn of you know, a Larry Nassar-like situation, that a child alleges that they were, you know, sexually penetrated by an adult, that, you know, we recognize that is inappropriate. It's a criminal act, and it has high recognition. You know, on the other side of it is low recognition. So, you know, touching offenses, physical offenses, and assault and abuse, you know, a forcible rape, that's high recognition. We all get that, and we need to respond to it, but we get it. You know, we know that that's sexual violence. On the low end of the spectrum, the second component, did I miss something? I'm sorry. I'm looking for, right. So we'll talk about what low recognition is in a moment there. You know, the other barometer in this continuum is about frequency, how often a behavior occurs. And so, you know, again, rape is the most extreme example, but it's probably one of the, you know, the most obvious examples here. You know, that we can assume that it also occurs with a lower frequency than, for example, say, sexist language. So that, you know, there isn't a lot of rape going on within an organization, right? But sexist language is something that happens frequently. You know, it occurs in a lot of everyday conversations. Some of it becomes, you know, sort of locker room, you know, vernacular, right? Don't be such a girl, take it like a man. You know, calling someone acting like a girl if they're demonstrating weakness. And we begin to look at popular music and shows and video games. You know, I think even if none of us realize it, that using this language casually, you know, begins to place some of this in the same continuum as sexual abuse. Did I mute here? Oh, I'm good. Okay. As sexual abuse. And so, you know, that with frequency. And so I think the things that we understand, you know, sexist language, you know, that occurs with a high rate of frequency versus incidents which occur with a low rate of frequency. Touching, physical abuse doesn't occur often, but sexist language occurs more often. When you begin to put these components together, right, that's when we begin to demonstrate what the sexual violence continuum is. And so that there are incidents with low recognition but occur quite often. And then there are instances with high recognition as to what it is, but don't occur often. As we've said, rape, for example, would fall in the low frequency, high recognition category. It doesn't occur often there. And so, you know, when these behaviors fall on the spectrum, you know, it doesn't have anything to do with their impact on the victim, right? That it's something, just because it occurs at one end of the spectrum or the other end of the spectrum doesn't mean it had a lesser impact on the victim there. And so high frequency, low recognition events of sexual violence, sexual harassment are still very impactful on that victim there. And so it's really not up to judge, you know, some of those things one way or the other as to where they are. And so when we really begin to look at it, you know, we place the whole thing on the sexual violence continuum together there. Some things occur with low frequency with high recognition. Again, your assaults and your physical abuses, your sexist languages, your crude drawings, your playing of crude, you know, a crude video or cartoon occurs more often, but we don't really recognize that as being being sexual violence or contributing to harassment there. And in the middle, I think, you know, is pornography, and this concept of slut shaming and sexual texts and emails and sexual remarks occurs probably more often than we care to recognize it occurs, but we're recognizing that's a problem there. And so, you know, it's important to think about this, you know, if you're taking this back to your organization, to draw these two lines and to begin to ask staff and coworkers or managers to place items, you know, on this continuum. You know, what happens with high frequency, but we don't really recognize maybe violence there or maybe harassment in nature. And society ends up allowing these high frequency, low recognition behaviors to slide through the cracks. And that's what builds this complacency for other higher recognition behaviors to occur. Once we've established, once we've established in, this space here that, within Snowwork, sorry. Trying to use the drawing pen. Once we've established that this is safe space for this to happen, it really tends to lead to this, because no one's calling out the staff member who's doing this, and so we need to be able to interact early here before this happens, and certainly before this happens. I hope that makes sense. Think of it as a pyramid, right? So that at the base of it are these high frequency, low recognition behaviors. Again, bad behavior there. Boorish behavior, locker room behavior, this, Trump on the bus, grab him by the pussy remark behavior. These are things that occur with high frequency, low recognition that is laughed off and said, and generally even accepted there. And it occurs more often. And that's that environment of complacency there. It begins to become normalized. And when it becomes normalized, we begin to create this culture of complacency. And I think that's been one of the great moments in MeToo, is that we're starting to break that culture of complacency, that apathetic bystanders don't occur anymore, that when, while it wouldn't have made great TV, or maybe it would have, we would have hoped that the Billy Bushes of the moment, when they hear the remark on the bus, when you grab him by that, he built into it there and laughed it off and is an apathetic bystander. And instead, we need to be able to intervene in situations that can begin to break it apart there. Similarly with children, that if there are children who are complaining about inappropriate behavior of adults who are taking care of them, if we allow it to happen, if we tell them to shut up and sit down, if we're not interested in their opinion or doing something about it, we're creating complacency and apathetic bystanders there. And these are people who can make a positive impact and begin to stop it early on there. And that leads to people being enablers and facilitators of that. Among the biggest shames of the Nassar case, and in many other child sexual abuse cases that we've dealt with, are the people who are enablers and facilitators, the people who abuse was reported to, and no one did anything about it. So the workplace where someone's constantly complained about, someone's comments, someone's actions, even a board of directors, if they learn of senior staff members' bad behavior, if they allow it to happen, they're enabling it. They're creating that environment there, and no one's safe. And so when they don't respond to it, we're enabling it and helping facilitate it. And ultimately, at the top of this pyramid are perpetrators, the people who are committing these crimes itself. But I think the perpetrator wouldn't be allowed to happen if he wasn't supported by all the pieces underneath that pyramid there. This top piece of the pyramid will come crumbling down. And by building this up, it allows people to perpetrate abuse there. These are attitudes, sometimes intentional and sometimes not, but they allow people to exploit their power and to get away with abuse, assault, and harassment. So how do we stop this? I think we need to address these cultural and social norms. I think you need to figure out where your organization stands on these high frequency, low recognition behaviors. This is where it starts and this is where it stops. The ability to talk to your organization and get them to begin to recognize and dispel bad behavior among people who are committing acts there. That we should stop that right away. We should understand and respect important boundaries and know how the JCC can impact better results there. What is that they can do to be dispelling harassment in the workplace? Understand what consent is. I think we should talk about what consent is outside of a sexual contact. That creates an environment where boundaries are understood and accepted there. So it isn't just about sex, but it is about boundaries, workplace boundaries in general, and really having people be okay with and expressing what's good for them and what's not good for them there. Particularly in new open space environments where people don't have private offices anymore. We need to come up with what boundaries mean. Create guidelines for consent. Let's maintain open communication, and that respecting that not saying no doesn't mean yes. That consent is a clear and enthusiastic yes. Particularly, that's more often with sex, obviously, but even with sexual conversation there. Let's make it a point to understand what is and what isn't appropriate behavior. Respecting, breaking away from these sort of gender normative expectations that, guys can talk up like this with guys and women will be like that around women. I think that we need to make this a broader conversation. There's inappropriate adult behavior, which impacts, child sexual abuse, and gives rise to those sort of environments there. That we shouldn't be having adult conversations with children, that we should let children be children and let them grow up in the spaces they're happy to do that there, that we shouldn't be having adult conversations with children there. And certainly there's a blurring of the line between texting and Facebook and with children, but I think if it's used, it's only used for professional purposes there. So really keeping a real line and distinction with adult behavior and child behavior there. And when it blurs that line, I think it's important for us to begin to address it and to say that we're not going to enable it from happening and put an end to it. I think it's important to understand what creates a hostile workplace, right? That, when these things add up, unwelcome harassment with a specific class that is severe and is based on the employer, interferes with that person to get their job done, that creates a hostile work environment there. And that's really, at the crux of understanding, what harassment is. And so that, when our workplace begins to continue to permit it, it creates a great deal of liability for all of us there. And employers, you should know this, can be liable for failing to prevent harassment. And unless it proves it attempted to prevent the harassment and that the employee failed to take advantage of those measures, for the employer, we're liable. So just because we didn't, that I think we have to be able to take efforts as employers to prevent these things from happening and to make it a safe space for our employees to be able to work with us. Just because someone acts boorish once doesn't mean they get fired, but it means that we as an organization need to be able to respond to it. And so, some of your homework is really based around what you can do to prevent harassment. And what are your countermeasures and tools there? That, one of the pieces of liability is that the employee needs to be able to take advantage of existing countermeasures. So is there a person in your workplace who employees can feel comfortable coming to explain that there's harassment going on, whether it's a staff member, a supervisor, or even a board member? That they can't just, necessarily keep these allegations to themselves. They have to be able to share them with someone. And then when we learn about them as leaders, as other responsible people, we have to respond and work to prevent the harassment from continuing. It's important to establish boundaries. I think boundaries are really key for youth and coworkers, and these are principles that we've shared with youth-serving organizations. But boundaries should be appropriate, observable, and interruptible. So that when we're having interactions with colleagues there, particularly if they're proving to be problematic or troublesome, that it should be appropriate. When you're acting with someone, it should be part of your normal job responsibility. It should be observable. That when you're interacting with colleagues, it should be in open view there. Behavior, behind closed doors can be problematic, and it doesn't mean that we can't supervise people in offices with closed doors anymore. But that your behavior should be appropriate as well with them. It's interruptible. What we found with when you look at some of the Matt Lauer situation is that he was able to allow harassment to continue in his office because he had full control. He was able to lock his door from his desk. That's weird. And I think that it creates a situation that is neither appropriate, observable, or interruptible there. We want people to be positive bystanders. We want them to normalize interventions and point out that it's inappropriate actions, and that we, rather than sort of uncomfortably laughing off an inappropriate joke or comments, we should hold each other accountable. And that it's not personal, that we're not saying this, that you can't say that anymore, it's not appropriate, it's not personal, that it's because this is the environment we're trying to create here. And so, if during the interview of a potential employee, somebody asks, well, how can you possibly be a mother and, and have children and perform all these functions at the same time? That's an inappropriate question. And I think it's important to jump in to say to the person who asked the question, that's not a great question to ask. And, it's offensive and it's potentially even illegal. Look, what do we do? What do we do if we discover abuse, assault, or harassment occurs? I encourage everybody to respond appropriately and to report it immediately. That we shouldn't, again, sit by complacently, but we need to take action very quickly on this there. Questions to ask within your own JCC is, do you have policies? Do you have policies regarding child abuse reporting? Do you have policies regarding sexual harassment reporting? Do you have annual trainings? Or is this the first thing you've done in 5 years, right? That within your own organization, you should have some level of annual training on these topics so that all of your staff, new staff, old staff, get on the same page as to what our responsibility is. Are there designated people so that people know that if there's an incident occurs that we talk to the director or the head of child life or the vice president of human resources or the president of the board of directors? And do you know your state's reporting laws? When it comes to child abuse, I think it's very important and critical that you know where to report child abuse to. And so, there's a lot of different things that you're required to respond to there. At your JCC, you should know, again, based on what the incident is, child abuse is a crime. You are required by law to report it. You have to report it out to law enforcement. And in many states, the law says you're supposed to report it up to JCC leadership. To dual version of reporting. And we always suggest to youth-serving organizations that even if it's not legally required to be reported to supervisors, it should be done anyway, so that the organization's on notice that something's happened there. Sexual assault is a crime as well. However, the sexual assault victim is not compelled by law to necessarily report it. That is up to her or him. And so I think it should be reported to law enforcement if a sex assault occurs, but we need to be able to get the consent of the adult victim, that we're really not at liberty to make a report of abuse, of a sexual assault, if that victim disagrees with us there or wants to not pursue legally. But I think we should be reporting the sexual assault internally to our JCC, to our leadership, to say, look, there's a sex assault that occurred here. We need to do something about it. And of course, finally, sexual harassment. Sexual harassment should be reported up to JCC leadership as well. As you can see with all of these, they all need to be reported up. That although the arrows are pointing down, but that's just a side note. You need to report these incidents up to leadership, that you can't solve this by yourself. And if your JCC leadership isn't being responsive on that, well, then that's a problem, and it's creating risk for the organization. I'd be remiss if I didn't share this with you, but I have to underscore the fact that child abuse is subjected to mandated reporting laws in all states. For the most part, anybody working at a JCC is a mandated reporter. Professionals working with children responsible for their safety. And if they have reason to believe abuse occurred, if they have suspected child abuse, they're required by law to report it there. You don't need a lot to make a report of child abuse. You just need their date of birth, their home address, their contact information, where that child is now, the nature of the abuse, and any other information. You are not required to make an investigation. I think it's really critical to understand that we don't want you to make an investigation of abuse. We want people to work with the system and be able to let them investigate it. We just have to report it there. And so, child abuse needs to be reported out very quickly and very efficiently. Typically, states require an oral report as soon as possible to your local child welfare office. Some states have a statewide number. Some states have, you call your local chapter, so to speak, your local child protective services. But know that you can always call 911 if you stumbled upon child abuse there. And I think once we've reported abuse, assault, harassment, we need to be able to build supportive systems around that. And by doing that, we're able to, in very much a lot of ways, protect the members who go to our JCCs, right? We want to protect our children who attend there. We want to protect our adults who are going there from sexual harassment and assault. We're protecting staff by reporting abuse, by stopping harassment before it starts. We're creating an environment that staff feels comfortable and safe at the JCC. And yeah, we're protecting the JCC. That by enforcing these policies, by putting these things in place, that's a really critical element to make sure that the organization will continue, because these are the kind of incidents and allegations that will sink an organization. And I think, I venture to guess that many of you work for the JCC, not just because it's a job, because you also believe in the mission. And so if we believe in the mission, we need to protect the mission and the institution there. And part of the reason we need to be able to respond to these cases when they come up is that we want to protect the JCC. And hopefully keep it the organization that's available to be that beacon in the community. And so with that said, at 2:58 p.m., I'm open to questions. So by all means, why don't you, if you have any questions you want to post on the chat list, I'm happy to answer them. Yeah, we can go from there. I will also paste in the chat a video that I think in a lot of ways captures this difficult conversation and this difficult moment that I think a lot of people have. It was on Saturday Night Live a couple weekends ago, and it's a good video that I think in some ways is a bit compelling to get people to at least think about some of these issues. Question: would love to hear a bit about how we nuance the difference between tattling and telling for our staff and campers. Look, I think the big difference is this. If you've got a camper who is talking about someone's touching their penis, their breasts, exposing themselves in a locker room, making sexually explicit comments to them, that's important to respond to. That's not tattling, that's not telling. We need to be able to listen to these complaints and be able to get to the source of it as to why is the child saying that there. And I think it's important, we need to be able to be supportive there with our campers and our students that, even if someone is constantly, saying that someone's being mean to them, someone's hitting them, we should honor that, because at a very early age, from kindergarten forward, we start saying to kids, don't be a tattletale, don't be such a whiny kid. Like, let's find ways to productively listen to these kids' complaints so that they feel empowered by adults, so that God forbid, when they need to be able to say something criminal has happened to them, that they know someone's going to listen to them. Gotti Paskoff, how are you? Good to see you. Best practices for training seasonal staff during the summer. Look, I think that summer staff, I think there's a couple things that one can do. Look, we run a great website that has a training for any mandated reporter. The material is a little bit more germane for Maryland, but it's something that anybody can take. It's reportabusemd.com. It's a free website that has a training there. I love live training. And I think it's important to bring an expert in, whether it's us, or someone who really knows how to talk about child abuse laws. But I think that you should very much, make sure that all of your staff are on the same page before you begin. That at a minimum, you lay out to your staff some basic rules that absolutely under no circumstances shall you have sexual interactions with kids. As stupid as it sounds, you need to lay that out to them. And that if they have reason to believe abuse has occurred either at camp or within their home environment and they're reporting it to you, you have a duty to report it. You need to just lay it out there, and it needs to be done before camp starts, and that you need to hold that to a strict guideline there. Why do people report to? Who do people report to if they feel they can't go to their executive? If their HR is not reliable? Look, most of our organizations are nonprofits. I think we should feel comfortable going to the board of directors. That we don't want to inculcate a workplace that is adverse to whistleblowing. And so that your organization should have a whistleblower policy, frankly. That it should be able to state there that if, someone feels they can't go to the executive director or the head of HR, that they should be able to go to, the chair of the board of directors. Really critical to be able to do that there. And the chair of your board of directors, or someone on your board needs to be part of this process as well. That JCCs are successful because it is that lay pro partnership. So your board needs to be brought on this. Should we investigate allegations of harassment or just follow reporting protocols? You know, harassment is not something that is generally, reportable by law. That there's no legal agency that's going to respond and take a report of sexual harassment. They will for children, but they won't for adults. And so the organization has a duty to be able to follow through. Just because someone's made an allegation doesn't mean that it happened, but it does mean we have to respond to it. And so I think it is up to the organization, depending on the severity of the allegation, to figure out, right, what are we going to do here? Are we going to, who else are we going to ask about this conduct and conversation, and is it appropriate and is it inappropriate? And there is some level of inquiry. And if the behavior is really bad, or if the behavior is involving someone very senior, you may have to bring an outside counsel, an attorney, an organization, a consultant to help deal with it there. Because I think a lot of organizations do the best they can do to try and figure it out, but we're not wired for that. JCCs shouldn't be doing their own self-inquiry and investigation there. I think they can find enough information and then say, we need to send this out to an attorney. It's going to cost you money, but it's a heck of a lot better than if we don't respond to it in the right way and we screw it up. If a supervisor engages in a consensual relationship with an employee who is 17 in a state where the age of consent is 16, would that be considered child sexual abuse? I think a couple things, so that if the employee is a full-time employee, a 17-year-old counselor or teacher, and not a student teacher, not a CIT, not someone who is paying to come to camp or part of a program, but someone who is truly, a full-blown staff member, then, it is not sexual child abuse, because that's a staff member there. That 16-year-old, is certainly culpable of, committing abuse upon the children that they're supervising there. But look, I think it also depends on the age of the supervisor. I think it just gets you in trouble, and I think it's just bad form that we probably want to frown upon our supervisors. I think we want to frown upon our supervisors engaging in sexual relationship with our 17-year-old employees. That it just doesn't smell right. And that if the supervisors are 20, even if the supervisors are 21-year-old, it's just not a good message. I think it's just a problematic relationship, and begins to blur the line. So it's not child sexual abuse, but I think there is a level of authority and influence there, and it just gets messy. And so I would frown upon it. Yeah. Other questions, campers, that we want to know here? Sally, want to know what videos are recommended. I'll send Sarah a couple of different links. I have some of them up, and maybe I can see what we can find here. Any questions there, Sarah? Or last parting thoughts and comments?
No, I don't see any more questions. If you do, you can send them to me and I will reach out to Adam. I just want to thank you so much for joining us today, and Adam for spending this past hour. I will be posting a recording of the webinar on jcca.me within the next few days, and also I will be sending around a survey with some of the links that Adam sends me. So thank you again. Any last thoughts, Adam?
No, I don't offhand there. So I was looking for a video that another one I'll just throw in the chat real quick here. That just trying to get the video that's just not coming up. Oh, here we go. Maybe this is it. Not the website I want, but yeah, I'll send. Can't find it. Nope. I'll, if you leave the chat open for a second, I'll throw it in there. I think this is the one I'm looking for.
Okay.
It's all scary.
Yeah, maybe that's it. So I'll share this with you. It's a great, again, this one goes about why people don't, what we don't understand what kids say. So there's a couple of video links within the chat log there, and I'll send you a couple other ones.
Great. Thank you so much for presenting today, and thank you for everyone who was on this call.
Yeah, thank you too. And look, good luck. I think that, the bottom line is you just need to do something, that you just can't sit by and shrug, that you need to be responsive to it as an agency, take notes and take action. And we're not equipped for these things. So, look for outside counsel and get some help here. Thanks.
Thank you.